Good morning. Please turn to Isaiah 42, please. Isaiah 42. All throughout the book of Isaiah, particularly the latter portion, he presents some sections about a servant that God is going to send to accomplish his will. And the tragic thing is, the nation of Israel was supposed to be God's servant. But because they continued to fail and to sin and to commit idolatry and all that goes along with that, God, through Isaiah, promises, I'm going to send another servant, a servant who actually accomplishes my will. Now, the servant song that we are the most familiar with is Isaiah 53. We're not as familiar, maybe, with Isaiah 42, but Matthew in Matthew 12 actually applies this section here in Isaiah 42. He applies it to Jesus. It says Jesus is fulfilling this. So notice what it says in Isaiah 42. I will say, we'll read verses 1 through 4. When we get down to verse 3, just know this idea of a bruised reed or a dimly burning wick or candle, that's a figurative way of talking about those who are weak, those who are poor, those who are vulnerable, oppressed, and distressed. So with that understanding, verses 1 through 4, behold, my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry out or raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not be disheartened or crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands will wait expectantly for his law. Justice is hugely important to God. In fact, later in Isaiah 61, God will say, I, the Lord, love justice. And one of the reasons that he's going to bring down punishment on the nation of Israel is because earlier in Isaiah 5, God says, I looked for justice among my people, but all I found was bloodshed. Now, typically, when we think about justice in the Bible, we think of punishment on the wicked. And that is certainly part of it, but that's actually not the main way that word is used at all, not even close. The Hebrew word for justice is mishpat. It's used over 400 times in the Old Testament. And in 90% of those cases, it's used about one's active care for the weak, vulnerable, and oppressed in society. It is primarily about using one's wealth, one's higher social status, one's louder voice to lift up those who are in less fortunate positions. Justice is about trying to make things right by helping other people flourish the way that I have been blessed by God to flourish. In other words, it's not primarily punitive in nature, it is restorative. And Isaiah says God's servant Jesus will rule with justice. Let's talk this morning about three things that means practically. First of all, Jesus treated all people with equal value, dignity, and honor. Justice starts with the recognition that all humans are made in God's image and are therefore worthy of our care and our concern. And we take that for granted because we're just so used to the Bible. And we're living in America, a society largely shaped by this principle in the Bible. But you have to remember the ancient world had no concept of this. The ancient world had no concept, either the Old Testament or the New Testament world, had no concept that all humans should be considered equal value. No. They determined your worth based on your social, financial, political, or military status in society. If you were poor, or you were weak, or you were sick, it meant you had nothing to contribute or offer to society, and therefore you were rejected as an outcast and nobody cared for you. So, for instance, just practically speaking, if you were a poor person and you brought a case to a judge because somebody wronged you, you were far less likely to win that case if the defendant was rich. Because if the defendant is rich, Either A, he might try to bribe the judge, and the judge will take the bribe, or the judge might think, look, if I let this rich person go, well, then he's going to kind of scratch my back later, right? He's going to do me a favor later. But there was no concept that the judge should actually be looking at the rights of this poor person with the same lens, right, and the same equality that he should look at the rights of the rich. And that was a unique thing among God's people in the Old Testament. So, for instance, you have verses like Deuteronomy 16:19, you shall not distort justice, you shall not be partial, you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Or a verse like this, Proverbs 22:2, the rich and the poor have this in common, the Lord is the maker of them all. Jesus ruled with justice because he treated everyone, no matter their status in society, as having equal value, honor, and dignity. He spoke with rich people for sure. I mean, he even went to eat in Matthew's house and later Zacchaeus' house. Those were rich, wealthy men. But of course, Jesus also helped the poor and the lame and the blind and the lepers, and all those who were socially marginalized. Look with me in Luke chapter 14. Here's a great example of this. In Luke 14, here Jesus goes to a feast in the house of one of the rich leaders of the Pharisees. And what he sees happening there greatly disturbs him. Because in Luke 14, in verse 7, it says, he began speaking a parable to the invited guests when he noticed how they had been picking out the places of honor at the table. These meals were like networking opportunities for the rich. Those with higher status, well, they would sit together at these meals in the places of honor, and all the rich people would kind of help themselves get even richer. They would find ways to help each other with their business or with their political maneuvers, basically helping each other climb the social ladder. The whole point of going to these meals was not really about the food. It was about the status. And it was all built on the idea of reciprocity. That was just a huge thing in the Greco-Roman world, that if you give a gift to someone, or say you host one of these meals, well then the recipients of that generosity are then obligated to repay you in some way, to help you in return. So if you think about it, they were basically, these people were just using each other to get ahead in life. And so now imagine how shocking it was when Jesus first of all told them, don't take the place of honor, instead take the lowly place. That was shocking enough. This was even more shocking when you get to verse 12. Look what he says in verses 12 to 14. He also went on to say to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors. Otherwise, they may also invite you in return, and that will be your repayment. But when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. The rich would never invite the poor to these meals because poor people could not reciprocate. Poor people could not do anything for them in return, and thus they had no value to them. So what Jesus is doing is he's dismantling a faulty system of judging a person's value, measuring a person's value based on their utility. In their society, one's worth was determined by how you could be used as a stepping stone to greatness. And Jesus is saying, no, human beings are not stones to be stepped on. They are images of God, to be cared for, to be valued, to be helped and elevated to a place of flourishing. And Jesus is saying, in order for you to truly be pleasing to God, you must humble yourself and allow yourself to become that stone to be stepped on, to elevate the poor and the vulnerable. And this really becomes real for us when you think about the social, well, really the universal status of the Son of God. Think about His greatness and what we could really offer Him in return. We are the weak and the poor and the vulnerable that have absolutely nothing to offer Jesus. And He could have treated us that way. He could have treated us like we were nothing to Him. Yet He treated us with equal value, honor, and dignity. by becoming our stepping stone, letting us step on him, trample on him, if you will, so that we could be elevated and lifted up out of our spiritual poverty and into the riches of heaven. Paul the Apostle described it this way in 2 Corinthians 8:9, "For your sake he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich." That is justice to God. Jesus ruled with justice. Secondly, Jesus delivered the vulnerable from oppression. Turn with me to Job chapter 29. Job 29. Biblical justice isn't just about viewing people equally, but it's about taking action to help people who are being victimized, either by individuals or by social customs or even systems of government. So in Job 29, we have this interesting section by Job. Remember, Job was a rich man, and Job was also a judge. And so he gives an awesome description of what it looks like to actually rule with justice. In Job 29, look in verse 12 down through 17. Verse 12, he said, "I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the one ready to perish came upon me, and I made the widow's heart sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case which I did not know, and I broke the jaws of the wicked and snatched the prey from his teeth." Amazing. Job not only treated orphans and widows and the poor with equal value, he acted on their behalf, not just to deliver them from their difficult situations, but to deliver them from evil people who are making their situations difficult. He tore them out of the jaws of the wicked. And this is all over the Old Testament, this concept, not just for judges and rulers, especially for them, but even for God's own people. Psalm 82 says, "Vindicate the weak and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and destitute. Rescue the weak and needy. Deliver them out of the hand of the wicked." Proverbs 31, which we think about as the chapter about a worthy wife. That's true. That's the end of the chapter. The first is about kings and how kings should rule. And he says, "Speak up for the mute, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Speak up, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and the needy." You think about God's character. He did this all the time. You think about him delivering the Israelites from oppression by the Egyptians in the Exodus. You think about the book of Judges, which over and over again, God continues to deliver them from their oppression. And what I find most amazing about God delivering the vulnerable from oppression in the book of Judges is because their oppression was their fault. They brought that oppression on themselves because of their idolatry, and yet God still delivered the weak and the victimized and the vulnerable from the hands of the wicked. If you think back to Luke 14 for a second, by Jesus convincing people to stop engaging in these feasts for the rich. Notice he talked to the host of that meal. He spoke directly to the one throwing this meal, and he said, "You stop this." By doing that, he was helping to stop the oppression of the poor, because these exclusive feasts were part of a social system that was actually keeping the poor from getting ahead in life, because it was cutting them off from all of the rich and influential people who could actually help them. It was indeed a system that was designed to help the rich get richer and to keep the poor poor. But notice the way he brings that system down. He brings that system down by changing the hearts of those within that system so that they'll stop perpetuating it. He rescues the poor and needy from evil people, not by going in there with a sword and, killing all the rich evil people. No, he rescues them from evil rich people by changing the hearts of the rich so that they won't take part in any system that oppresses the poor any longer, so that they will become like Job and pursue justice instead. And of course, Jesus' main concern wasn't just oppressive social systems, but Satan's oppression of people's souls. The Gospels present Jesus as a new Moses who has come to rescue his people from oppression, not from Pharaoh, but from Satan's tyranny. And so he goes around casting demons out of people. I think about the lady in Luke 13 who was bent over double and had some sort of affliction in her back caused by a demonic spirit. Jesus casts that demon out, and then when he talks about her, he says she's a precious daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years. This becomes so real for us when we realize we were the vulnerable victims who were oppressed by Satan and by a system of law that kept us trapped in sin and death. And while, yes, our oppression was largely our fault, it was also Satan's fault. And so Jesus came to deal with both of us, with all of us. He came to die on a cross and raise from the dead to rescue us not only by changing our hearts, but by destroying the power of sin and death, tearing us out of Satan's jaws so that he cannot oppress or victimize us anymore. Jesus ruled with justice. And finally this morning, justice does mean what that first thought, that comes to our head about what it usually means, rendering punishment as payment for evil. The punitive nature of justice. The interesting verse, Proverbs 21:15 says, "The exercise of justice is joy for the righteous, but is terror to the workers of iniquity." The flood was an act of God's justice against evil. The plagues on Egypt, the attacks of Assyria and Babylon against the sins of Israel and Judah. And interestingly, every single time in Scripture, God carries out an act of punitive justice. It is against people who have ignored restorative justice in their lives. When we fail to show concern for the weak and vulnerable and we use them for our own benefit at their expense, it angers God, and He carries out justice against our injustice. And the most amazing thing is, we've all been guilty of injustice, of not living righteously toward our fellow human beings. We're all deserving of the punitive justice of God. Yet in His mercy, God says, "I will take the punishment for your injustices upon myself." And the only thing powerful enough to accomplish that would be for Him to allow the greatest act of injustice ever perpetrated in the world to be carried out against His Son on the cross. It is almost as if, and I don't mean this in some magical sin bubble being transferred to Jesus sort of way, I'm just talking about the magnitude of the sin against the Son of God. It is almost as if Jesus took upon Himself the sum total of every ounce of injustice humans could possibly commit against each other. Because think about it, from an earthly perspective, right? We know who Jesus really is, but from a societal, earthly perspective, you have this perfect, innocent, poor, weak, invulnerable Jesus of Nazareth, crucified by people who do not care about the innocent, the poor, the weak, and the vulnerable. They did not care about justice. In one more verse, in Romans 3 and verse 26, an interesting statement made here about what God did for us on the cross through Jesus. Really, the second part of the verse is where I want to focus. That He would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. The cross demonstrates the justice of God because it shows us His care and His concern to elevate and help the weak and the vulnerable to flourish. That's us. But it also shows His commitment to not allowing evil to go unpunished. But He punished evil in such a way to make it possible for we, the unjust, to be justified and made right with Him. Jesus ruled with justice by justifying us. And now that we, the weak and vulnerable, have been lifted up and exalted, we can then become like God's servant and continue to carry out justice in the lives of those around us. Praise God that Jesus ruled with justice.